management. And for that, we have Chris McDonald, our Natural Resources Advisor at UC Cooperative Extension in San Bernardino, to be our first presenter. So Chris, you can take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay, we're all good, Bea? Excellent. So today I'm going to be talking, I'm just going to be briefly mentioning weeds and fire and revegetation. This is a whole huge topic and lots of balls of wax to untangle there if I'm going to mix up metaphors. But you feel free to email me, cjmcdonald@ucanr.edu, to get in contact with me. So I'm going to be mostly focusing on two topics, or two issues within how weeds and fires are linked to each other. The first half of my talk, I'm going to focus on how weeds are often carrying fires. They're the fuel source that is closest to ignition sources, and then they're carrying that fire to our native plant communities that are then creating larger and more intense fires. And then the second way weeds and fires are linked is that after we have a fire, so in our post-fire landscape, which we've heard a lot about, weeds can reduce the amount of native vegetation reestablishing onto those burned sites. I do want to get back to kind of go back in time a little bit here and just try to imagine a Southern California that doesn't have weeds on it, because outside of areas that are dominated by forests or chaparral, most areas in Southern California are dominated by non-native species, especially in the valley floors. So if we can imagine going back to 1888 and looking at the landscape, somebody wrote the quote, in this city, the exotic filiary erodium was relieved by bright orange rugs, solid beds of brilliant poppies. There were lavender-colored lilies, bright red cardinal flowers, pretty crucifers, vast bunches of violets, cream-colored bellflowers, 1888. So my question to you is where is this place? Where in Southern California can we imagine where there's bright orange rugs? Now, assuming that there is some exaggeration here, but still, bright orange rugs, solid beds of brilliant poppies. We're talking about a lot of wildflowers on the landscape. They're not talking about individual plants here. We're talking about vast bunches of violets. Now, vast and violets makes great alliteration, but still, again, they're talking about large scales of wildflowers. So type into the chat box where you might think this city is in Southern California. I see Riverside, I see downtown LA. Another for Riverside. Antelope Valley, Altadena, in the foothills. San Diego. So Christina, I assume you'll mean San Diego City, but Irvine. Okay, so there's a lot of great guesses in there, and a lot of those guesses are around places that currently have quite a bit of wildflowers when we do get rainfall. But this quote actually came from Pomona. And if you've driven down the 10 or the 57 through Pomona, you don't see beds of poppies and vast areas of violets. It looks pretty brown, pretty weed infested. It's not exactly jumping for joy when we get a great springtime rainfall event. And I just point this out to just kind of highlight how much large chunks of Southern California have changed. because we used to have lots of areas that were filled with wildflowers, and now we have lots of areas that are filled with weeds, thousands upon thousands of acres. And when it does bloom in the hills near Pomona, this is pictures taken in Benelli Park in San Dimas, which is just north of Pomona. The landscape is filled with non-native mustards, mostly black mustard, but still, again, all of this yellow, which is very pretty, is all non-native weeds. So again, we're talking about really large scale landscape transformations happening in Southern California with all of these weeds outside of our forested and chaparral areas. And so getting back to this idea of, weeds are carrying fire from ignition sources. So weeds tend to dominate in areas that are disturbed. And these disturbed areas also have many ignitions because they're on roadsides, they're near the wildland urban interface. And Max did a great job talking about how the wildland and urban interface interacts with fire and also near power lines. And so these are the areas where we have lots of ignitions and we have lots of weeds. And the weeds that are dominating in these areas, I can see these two roadside pictures in the bottom here, are often annual grasses and herbaceous dicots. And so when they dry out, they easily can carry fire from the roadside. So if a car broke down on the side of the road here or was dragging chains or something like that, the spark comes out to the side of the road, catches the grass burns 10, 15 feet in, and then picks up on the chaparral here and the fire's gone. So again, it's the weeds in our natural areas are that link between these high fire areas and the native communities. And so looking at this picture here, again, we have, this is up near Garner Valley, up in the San Jacinto Mountains. And we're looking at the left side of the road and the right side of the road. You can obviously see that one of these sides of the roads, if there was an accident to happen on the side of the road, there's a high likelihood of that roadside ignition source carrying off to the rest of the grassland there. And it's pretty obvious that the left side of the road is much more flammable than the right side of the road. So I think this kind of perfectly highlights that connecting disturbed areas. Like I mentioned a little bit before, the weeds, especially the annual grasses in Southern California, are one of the most flammable vegetation types on the landscape. They are really good at picking up sparks or other small ignition sources and turning them into a small moving fire. And so as we have gone from having a landscape in Southern California that was dominated by a lot of wildflowers, which tend to break down over the year, and we've had increasing amount of weeds, we're increasing the amount of likelihood of a fire is starting and spreading near ignition sources. And so you can see here this picture where you have, mostly wall-to-wall bromes and oats. There's a really good chance that anywhere a fire starts on this landscape, it's going to continue to the rest of the landscape without any sort of intervention. So I hope I'm making this connection that weeds are, especially the annual weeds, are the fuels on the landscape that can connect ignition sources to the rest of the wildlands. And a lot of this is somewhat similar to what we're used to with talking about ladder fuels. And so when we think about ladder fuels in a forest, we can use that same concept and think of it as laddering fuels from the roadside to our wildlands. And so again, kind of the model of, laddered fuels, which I hope you've all heard this concept before, but working from the small vegetation and then working its way up into the tree canopy. If we just imagine us driving down the road in our Ferraris and accidentally peeling out because we're going way too fast on Mulholland Drive or wherever we're going and starting a little wildfire on the side of the road, it then moves out into the chaparral or the shrubland. So again, that same concept applies. And what's really interesting to me is that we have this goal. I'm sure you've all seen this infographic here on the right about defensible space that CAL FIRE puts out. And where you have in zone 1 near your house, you have a reduced vegetation area. And then in zone 2, you're pruning up all your trees, keeping everything widely spaced. And we have a similar concept, the same concept of defensible space applies from heavily trafficked areas and into our wildlands. Again, here on the left, you can see the road, and then you have a shoulder that has almost no vegetation in it. And then next to the shoulder, you're looking at a reduced vegetation buffer between the wildland, here's grassland, and the roadside. So if there is some sort of accident happening on this roadside, hopefully whatever sparks are being generated are dying out on the shoulder. But if they aren't dying out on the shoulder, then maybe they're igniting some of this reduced vegetation here, and that fire isn't going to make it onto the grasses or into the grassland. So kind of covering the second half of my talk and looking at post-fire environments and how weeds are linked to fires. So after a fire in a post-fire landscape, weeds reduce the amount of native vegetation recovering on the landscape. And this happens in multiple ways and on multiple scales. And I'm just giving a super brief overview here, because again, we could talk about this, or at least I could talk about this, all day long. One of the ways that weeds are affecting post-fire survival happening in restoration projects, but also on resprouting plants, is that the weeds grow really dense. And because they're growing really dense, and many of our weeds are annual grasses, they are using water and using nutrients more efficiently than individual native plants. And because they're doing that, they're basically leaving less available water or less available resources for those native plants. So here we have on the left, we have a sugar bush that's in a weeded restoration plot, and we have its partner over here on the right, which is in a restoration plot that's not weeded. And so even though this is a potted plant, but you can see that the survival of this sugar bush, just surrounded by so many bromes, is not going to be very high, partly because all of those grasses are just sucking so much water out of the ground and using so much nutrients that are then not left for the sugar bush. And long story short, we have lots of data to support this point, but here's a great picture that I took of one of our restoration studies. And if you leave a whole bunch of weeds out on a restoration site, you'll have very low success when those weeds are present. And so you can just basically see this in this picture here. Here's some weed-free plots, and you can see that there's, a good half dozen or maybe a dozen native plants that are in this weed-free plot that you can easily see. And here's another. Up here, we have some weed-reduced plots. And if you squint really hard, and trust me, there are a couple of native plants that you can see through the annual grasses here, but they're not doing so great. And then on our untreated control plots, there are plants that we have put out on this landscape, but because there's so many weeds, they're just really, really hard to see. And so if you can just imagine being surrounded by 100 or even 1,000 neighbors who are all trying to get a little sip of your water while you're drinking out there, and you're a plant stuck in the ground, you're not going to do well when you're just surrounded by weeds on your restoration sites, compared to on the plots here, like where it's weed free. You can just see this from a distance. And so part of this starts at the very, very small size for weeds. Weed seedlings are often more competitive than the seedlings in native plants, especially the native perennials that we have in our coastal sage scrub and in our chaparral. But they're also more competitive than many native annual wildflowers as well. So even just when we have a seed bank of weeds that are present after a fire, those weed seedlings are really going to thrive, because in that open, high light post-fire environment, you're going to have a really large density of weed seedlings coming up. So here's a picture of stinknet, and you can see the stinknet plants are coming in at more than 1 seedling per square centimeter. And when you're in the middle of the season, it's basically can turn into a carpet of stinknet. Which I'm pretty sure there's an Amsinkia buried somewhere in here. I just don't know where it is anymore, because there's just so much stinknet coming in. But again, it doesn't have to be stinknet. It could be bromes, it can be oats, it can be mustards. There's just so many weeds out there that have this life strategy of having so much competition and putting out so many seedlings in a small amount of area that it really just crowds out the natives. And when we're looking at I say, and kind of looking at this from a different scale, you can see here's one lupin surrounded by a whole bunch of erodium. And here's a California buckwheat seedling that again is surrounded by some erodium, and maybe there's some mustard in there as well. Again, it's really hard to survive when you are that one plant surrounded by a whole bunch of neighbors that are doing a better job at growing up than you are. Another way that weeds can infect post-fire environments is that on large fires, crews from all over the US and sometimes even the world will come in to assist with fighting the fire. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing at all. I'm saying that we do need the help with controlling the fire. However, one of the side effects of having crews coming in from all over the world or the US is that occasionally new weeds will show up having accidentally been transported on contaminated equipment, tools, clothes, boots, vehicles, whatever. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be decontaminating. Decontamination is highly effective and we should still be doing it. What I'm saying is even when we're decontaminating, trying our best effort, weeds can still slip through. So for example, on the copper fire, there were about 2,000 firefighters on site. If 1 in 1,000 of those firefighters hadn't perfectly decontaminated to 100%, then there's a chance that there were 2 new species of weeds showing up after the copper fire. So again, it's just that we have these such huge numbers of personnel and vehicles and other things coming in from all over the US on these large fires. When you have large numbers, even these small 1 in 1,000 type of events can happen, and they'll be showing up on our fires regularly in our post-fire environments. And so because these crews are arriving from all over, it is really, really critical to locate and try and eradicate these new weed species before they establish and spread. And we talked about this a little bit, or previous speakers talked about this a little bit, where it might take a year, it might take several years before you actually identify these, but those surveys are really, really important. And it also happens at a time when a whole bunch of other work needs to be done as well. We heard about erosion control, we heard about riparian restoration and sensitive species surveys. So all the biologists that are out after these fires have a whole bunch of things to do. And new invasive weeds need to be a top priority. But again, because we only have so many people out there, we're really limited. And again, I pointed out earlier that weeds thrive in disturbed areas, and our recently burned landscapes are disturbed areas. And so one of these weeds that thrives in disturbed areas, stinknet, I'm using this as an example, but we can use all sorts of different weeds. So this is the Santa Rosa Plateau in Western Riverside County, kind of near Murrieta. And it did not have a huge stinknet problem in 2019 or 2020. There were just a couple of points that were found near the preserve. And after the Tanaha fire burned the area in 2019, they found hundreds upon hundreds of stinknet plants spreading in the post-fire area. So again, is this a question of the stinknet is now thriving in that post-fire environment, or was there some contamination issues where local crews accidentally transported stinknet seed on their tools and whatnot? I don't know, but the end of the day is that they had a lot more stinknet post-fire on the preserve than they did before the fire happened. It's nice kind of coming in, and no one so far has talked about the invasives and fire cycle. So one of the ways that weeds can impact post-fire environments is that they can create a positive feedback cycle. And so when the weeds are dominating in a post-fire environment and they reduce the survival of those natives, when that area burns again, and because those weeds tend to be highly flashy fuels where they're more likely to burn, when it burns again, it reduces the native plants even more, which then increases the weed population more, and then it burns again. So you get this cycle where you start out having a low weed density in a pre-fire area, and then you burn it and the weeds start to expand, and then it burns again and the weeds start to expand even more, and then you burn it a third time. And you might have a really large area that's now covered with a lot of weeds. It's often happens with our annual weeds, especially annual grasses. but also can happen with perennial grasses as well. And because annual grasses are one of the most highly flammable vegetation types in Southern California. This is sometimes called the invasive grass fire cycle, or the grass fire cycle, or the weed fire cycle. It's very common in the Western US, happens in California. And part of this is related to declines in chaparral and coastal sage scrub in Southern California. I want to take a quick tangent on that topic of declines in chaparral and sage scrub related to short return intervals for fire. Repeated fires at short return intervals of about less than 10 years have been linked with declines in both of those shrub communities. And this is that grass fire cycle that I talked about. The shrubs get replaced with annual weeds, mostly grasses. But this doesn't always happen with fire. Sometimes, or it doesn't always happen because of the weeds. Sometimes landscape and post-fire climate can be more important than fire return intervals. So again, like we talked a little bit about earlier, how this can happen with fire, but can also happen without fire. The weeds can invade with fire and the weeds can invade without fire. It really just kind of depends on what type of area and landscape we're looking at. So I think I made this clear. The weeds are increasing regardless of whether these landscapes are burning or not, because these weeds are responding to other disturbances like floods, erosion, drought, soil disturbance, historic livestock grazing. And some weeds are just more competitive than native plants, and they're going to transform our ecosystems with or without fire. Pointing to one of these transformer species, the bromes. If we look at ripgut brome here, the map on the top here, you can see that's mostly invading inland and coastal areas, and this is the weed that is dominating in a lot of areas around Pomona. And if we look at red brome is also doing a really good job of invading in the deserts. And Max talked earlier about how fire is starting to move out into the deserts. And one of the fuels that is now in areas like Joshua Tree that wasn't there historically is these red bromes in wet years. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. Our first ripgut collection in LA County was in 1903, and Riverside County was 1903, and San Diego was 1891. So again, this has happened in about the last 120 years or so. And when I mentioned that quote earlier about 1888, the author never mentioned how bromes were invading the landscape around Pomona. So bromes were even after that. And I think that kind of helps to show how all those wildflowers in Pomona were starting to have declines because these grasses are just so invasive.
We're running out of time if you don't
Okay.
mind.
Oh, all right. So here's a bunch of different ways to manage weeds. I'm almost done. And I guess my last point will be, I'll skip to this slide here, that scale matters, and that it is really, really difficult to work on some of these larger scales when we have these really large fires. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I had to push a little bit, but I want to leave enough time for our panelists to also do their respective presentation. Thank you so much, Chris. As always, really good presentation. And I'm going to introduce now our panel members. And remember, if you have any questions, you can start putting them already in the Q&A. And then after all three panelists present, all of them and Chris can answer questions from you. So our three panelists today are Kathleen De Los Reyes. She's a forestry assistant at LA County Fire Department. We have Jim Hartman. He's a deputy ag commissioner at LA County in the Integrated Pest Management Division. And Thierry Brivard, he's the director of mountain forestry with Tree People. So with that, I'm gonna let our panelists have the time. So maybe Kathleen, would you like to start? And she might not be here because I don't see her, or she might be having some technical difficulties. So maybe we'll just get back to her and start with Jim.
I'll shoot her an email and see if everything's okay.
Thank you, Annika.
Hi, how's everybody today? So my name is Jim Hartman. I'm at the Los Angeles County Agriculture Commissioner Weights and Measures Department, where I'm the Deputy Ag Commissioner in charge of the Integrated Pest Management Division. So we have a duality in invasive weeds and weed management. Certainly we enforce all the pesticide use and other things related to chemical usage. Also in my program, we also do vegetation management and are responsible for the treatment of A-rated weeds and invasive weeds in the county. And of course, the Ag Commissioners are a resource to anyone who's doing this kind of work. My light went out, sorry. Within the county, so that we're a resource to you as well for anything that relates either to pesticide use in any context, and certainly invasive weeds. I don't particularly have a presentation per se. You know, my topic was on the laws and regulations regarding weed management, and which is kind of an odd disposition here, because weeds per se are not illegal to have on your property, except if you're in an area where you are adjacent to structures and things, and you're notified that it's a public nuisance and you have to clear weeds. But you are not allowed to have A-rated weeds. You know, the California Department of Food and Agriculture rates weeds, just like they have things like Mediterranean fruit fly, which basically in the state is not allowed to exist. So if you're a property owner and have A-rated weeds, and there's about 24 or so of them at the moment, because they're considered to be of such impactfulness on the environment and in agriculture. They're just simply not, and they're a limited distribution in the state. They're just not allowed to exist. So things like in my county, I have alligator weed and halogeton, which I guess they just got downloaded to a B-rated pest. But the thing is that we have as a responsibility to remove those and try to eradicate those from the landscape. Any property that they're found on is also, it's the landowner's responsibility to make sure that that's not an issue. Sorry, terrible phone. Anyway, so they're not allowed to exist on the property. So it's the property owner's responsibility to make sure that those weeds don't exist. The Ag Commissioner is more than willing to work with you to eliminate those. And so one of the things it's helpful after fire recovery is that you know what invasive weeds are already on your property. So hopefully, now obviously the Angeles National Forest is too large of an area for anybody to have walked all of it to know where all the invasive weeds are. Although certain corridors, like things along roadsides, things like that, are obvious places where you could do surveys, places where they allow special use permits for bees and things like that, which could bring in invasives, could be an issue as well. But the thing is it's helpful to know what you already have in inventory, because once a fire comes through there, you know, they throw fire retardant on there. The major constituents of fire retardant, if you don't know, is ammonia and phosphorus. In the ag industry, that's fertilizer, you know, so you get a little bit of water on that and you're going to get seed bank coming up almost immediately. So you need to, and it's helpful to be able to respond to that as quickly as possible. And if you already know what you have out there, you have an idea of what you may be dealing with. Besides what Chris is talking about, you bring in folks from all over the Western United States with equipment. Usually it has to be washed before it comes on site into the forest or any response, but sometimes that doesn't happen, or there may be isolated populations within a forest or a wildland area that may be infested that no one knows of. And so it gets moved around. Certainly bulldozers do a lot of moving around of dirt as well and soil. So there's a lot of issues that can be brought within the forest or within the area where you're doing your clearance. So so anyway, but it's also you need to get out there as soon as possible and survey. And I know that that's pretty common practice, but it's helpful to see what's coming up and throughout the season, look at what's coming up and then deal with a program to address that as best as possible. it's been my experience, because I've done a lot of work with the Forest Service, particularly in the Copper Fire in the San Fran Canyon area, that the sooner you can get back out there and start treating, whether it's mechanically or however method you choose to use, it has a greater response. Because I know that in most of the time that we've had situations where we come across disturbed areas, weeds generally don't do well against established native vegetation. They need these inroads to be pushed out to allow them to establish, and then they start colonizing beyond that. But when in areas where we can give natives a chance to recover first, they do very, very well, and they help limit the spread of invasives. So it's really important to come up with a plan to deal with invasives as they come up, and know where they're at, and over time how they're progressing. And your local ag commissioner's office is a resource to help you with those sorts of things, whether it's chemical control and permits that may be needed, or things along those lines, or advice about what do I have out there. This is a weird plant. Is it an A-rated plant? You know, and we have botanists on staff to do those sorts of things as well. So we're a resource to help you folks recover and be a opportunity to bring collaborations too. I also head the weed management area for LA County, and one of the things that's been most satisfying for me is to bring diverse groups together for common projects and use their resources to help make the job much more simple. Because I'm sure someone has already dealt with whatever issue is going on, and invasive weeds, whether it's a catastrophic burn like a fire or any other situation, they take advantage of that, and it's always nice to have that group of folks there to be your team. So outside of that, I think that's about all I had to say.
Thank you so much. We're gonna give the mic now to Thierry, if you want. Take it away, and we have Kathleen on the call as well, so she can talk after Thierry.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Thierry Rivard, and I work for Tripol. I'm the Director of Mountain Forestry there. And I have a short presentation that I'm going to share with you. And after all this really great information about what invasive do to our landscape and all that, I think it may be a little bit refreshing to see an area where we've done some restoration. So let me go ahead and share my screen. There you go. So hopefully you can now all see this presentation.
Yes.
So let me go back by one. Sorry. So Tripol is a nonprofit that's been around for about 45, almost 50 years now. And we've been working in the Angeles National Forest for several decades, doing a lot of reforestation efforts. And in the last 10 years, we've shifted to do a lot more of restoration work that includes chaparrals. And I'm going to talk to you about a project that we're conducting in the San Francisco Canyon, where we're doing some chaparral restoration in the Copper Fire scar. And to give you a little bit back of the story, the Copper Fire, for those of you who don't know, burned in 2002. It burned more than 20,000 acres of chaparral, coastal sage scrub, even some natural stands of big cone Douglas fir. And obviously that was a big disturbance, but this area has been impacted by humans for a long time. If you see the photo on the right, this is the leftover of the San Francisco Dam at the time when it broke in 1928. And the area that we've been restoring is actually an area that was underwater at the time that we had this dam in San Francisco. So a lot of disturbances. And if we look at what it looked like when we started, this is the result of a lot of human disturbances. We brought in those invasive species. There was possibly some grazing in the area for quite a while. There was water when the dam was present, and then there was fire, multiple fires probably, but also the 2002 copper fire that resulted in this landscape covered mostly with invasive plant species. The areas that we started to restore were pretty much 90 and above % all invasive plant species. And so the first step for us was to look at what was there, and just took a few different examples here. On the left, you have tamarisk, a very high priority. In the center, you have one of the mustards that we find in our landscape. This one is Hirschfeldia in Canada, the Mediterranean or mustard, and then you have some burr clover on the right. So different plants, different treatments, different ways to deal with them. The tamarisk was a very high priority. This and some tobacco tree who were present at the site were removed early on, just to make sure, as Chris was mentioning earlier, early detection, making sure you don't get this plant in and you don't leave it in your landscape. That's the best way to make sure it's not going to propagate. So what's here and then what's missing, and what was missing mostly was invasive plant. But you can see in this photo, we have a number of different invasive species. We have some burr clover, we have some mustard in the background, we have some red brome, but we also have some lupine. So it's always the difficult thing about how do we remove the invasive plants that are growing around our native plant species, and how do we selectively do this work. Of course, at the start of a big restoration project, there's a lot of planning. You need permits, you need to collect seeds, you need to do a lot of steps. So I'm just throwing this out there. It's not as sexy, but we do a lot of that. That's the way we work. Without planning, without making sure you have all the right steps, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And then, of course, you have to find plants that you're going to be planting in your restoration project if it's an active restoration and not a passive restoration project where you just remove the invasive plants. In our case, we've worked with 2 nurseries, the Tree People Nursery and the California Botanic Garden Nursery. Those 2 nurseries are approved by the Forest Service to procure plants. Maybe you don't know this, but we have a pathogen right now that has infected some restoration project in the past. It's called Phytophthora. It's a killer of plants. It's a water mold. And so only nurseries that have the capacity to produce plant without this pathogen are allowed to produce plant for the Angeles National Forest, which is our case. And the California Botanic Garden was the first nursery to get this right. So it's a lot of management practices that are very heavy, and a lot of cleaning with bleach and other things like this. But this is how you can get plants and make sure you're not bringing more contaminants into the forest. The other thing, because we're a volunteer-based organization, is there's a lot of community organizing that happens at first. And this is just a handful of volunteers that helped us at this project. This project has been going for 4 years. We started in 2018. We are at the time when we've had about 5,000 volunteers, individual people coming and participate in this effort. The implementation, obviously, depending on the season when you start, you may have to clear dry plant material like this is in this photo, or it might be plants with seeds. So there's a lot of different ways to deal with invasive plants, as been discussed before me in more eloquent ways, but we try to find the best way to make our project successful. So if you're able to remove the plants when they have the seeds before you start your project, if you can do all of this work before you start planting, you're going to have better results. Techniques are always mixed. Sometimes you just remove the above plant material just to get the seeds out of the landscape. Sometimes it's just pulling with hands. That's what we do with a lot of our volunteers, and tarping, bagging, removing from the forest, making sure you're not bringing this contaminant elsewhere. And sometimes you also need other people to help you. So that's where we have crews from the Forest Service and come and burn some of the piles that we make out of invasive plants on the site. This way, there's no risk of contaminating other sites. Piling them there, getting them burned has been the best way when we can do it. And then, of course, after you've taken care of all that, or while you're taking care of all this, you're going to be planting and maintaining the plant. Because we work with volunteers, a lot of people want to come and plant trees or plants. Not a lot of people want to necessarily come and just water them. It's always a difficult proposition, but we tend to think that maintenance is more important to establish these plants in the first 2 years to make sure they have. And now I'm just going to go through satellite views of the site that we started 4 years ago. As you can see, this is in April 2017, when the green part in the center of the site is just mustard growing and ready to bloom and cast their seed. And in the following months, all of this gets dry. You can see all the weeds being just ready to catch on fire and distributed all around the site. Once this was removed, you have an open site. You can see maybe the little dots on your screen on the left side of the site are just our plantings. And in the following season, in the fall, we planted the right side of the site. And this is a year and a half after. You can already see the plants taking over. And I'm sorry for the next slide being a little bit blurry, but this is the photo from last year, a satellite photo. And you can see that the plant community where we've planted is starting to look closer and closer to what we have surrounding the site, meaning the restoration is being successful. Just a quick look at the way it was before. You get all this invasive plant material, and now a nice chaparral starting to establish itself again. Again, a couple of photos of before and after. So you can see that it's possible. And I do want to say, this is not all our work. A lot of the work is done by nature in the photo to the right in the center. All of this is just verbena that was allowed to grow back once we removed the weeds from that area.
Thierry, I'm gonna ask you if you can wrap it up so we can give Kathleen a...
Yes, I'm about done. So this is the site as it is now. And obviously, it just not helped just with the diversity of plant, but also with wildlife. I just want to mention our partners. This is funded by NIFWIF and the Forest Service, Recon, who does a lot of work with us, the California Botanic Garden, and the Santa Clarita Water Agency that provides the water. And just to finish, I thank you for your patience and following this with me, but I also want to make sure we're all aware that we're not just talking about plants. Obviously, wildlife appreciates this work. We've had a lot of amazing encounters with wildlife since the restoration has started to happen, and a lot of the diversity of insects is just amazing. Thank you all.
Thank you, Thierry. Kathleen, do you want to take the mic?
Yeah, sure. My name is Kathleen De Los Reyes. I'm with LA County Fire Department as a forestry assistant. I spent a couple years of my career actually focusing on oak tree protection and mitigation of the gold-spotted oak borer. Currently we have it in Green Valley, so we're trying to keep it there. A lot of what we're currently doing is obviously removing the infected oak trees, and we're getting into trying to get some grants to cover injection as to lessen the impact of oak tree removals. Though that's unfortunate, we are fortunate enough that a lot of these oak trees they recover post-fire as well as post-GSOP projects. And they do come back in a lot of the trees that we removed back in 2019 have grown back up to 15 to 20 feet tall. I mean, they look like bushes right now, but eventually they will pick dominant leaders to grow as trees. The one thing that we are combating, and unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of doing work in a lot of these areas because they are in private property, is that we are combating the tree of heaven. And a lot of the areas where we have removed oaks, gave way to a lot of tree of heaven to grow in full force. And as much as everybody knows that they are invasive, a lot of people in Green Valley love them because they do provide like the changing of colors depending on during fall, and a lot of homeowners do tend to keep them. They're not protected, so they can take them whenever they want, and unlike oak trees where they have to apply for permits and whatnot. And we're also doing oak tree propagation. So we collect oak trees from Green Valley all the way to the high deserts. We want to keep the strain of oak trees within the same microclimate that we have in the high desert, so that they are adapted to that kind of weather. We've seen we're actually introducing a lot of scrubs, scrub oaks, just to kind of give the landscape a little bit more of different kind of oaks, because unfortunately Green Valley is mainly dominated by coastal live oaks, and that is why a lot of the trees are being removed because of the monoculture of oak trees we have in that area. So we don't do the planting ourselves. We distribute the oak trees to our constituents, to the public, and they can plant it wherever they want in their property, because we don't have a lot of the manpower and resources to plant an entire area of tree, an entire area where oak trees have been removed. So we distribute those oak trees after 1 year to 2 years of full growing season. They're typically in 2 to 3 gallons once they're ready to be distributed. And as far as for post-fire in LA County jurisdiction, we used to do plantings, but I don't believe we do that anymore, because a lot of it is in private areas, in private lands. So I know that's really it for me. So
Thank you so much, Kathleen. We are a little bit over time, so we don't really have much time for questions right now, although for all of you attendees, feel free to put them in the Q&A chat, and both the presenter and panelists can answer them in the Q&A chat or Q&A box. So thank you again, Chris, Kathleen, Jim, and Thierry. And we'll move on to our next section so we can kind of try to stay on schedule.